And in the political realm, in the society realm, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I would prefer to have freedom, and I enjoy having that. But we're also called in the theological realm to love other people and love not our own life even unto death. There's a this walk of faith in Jesus Christ is a call to a sacrifice, not a call to just maintaining our comforts all the time. And so I watch how this is going on, and when I look at this Matthew 24 chapter in this passage, it's kind of split into two parts, and Jesus is saying, the first part, if you think that's bad, then he says, and that's what we're going to look at tonight. We're going to look at the and then statements of Jesus. Because all of a sudden, there's a transition point that he uses of the illustration of pregnancy. And it's kind of like, it causes me to think, is he saying that if you think that's bad, not just wait, it's going to get worse, but if it is going to get worse, then my thinking on this is, if we've responded without loving our neighbor, but we've put our freedoms first in times where it's not yet, then what would the church's response be when the pressure really comes? Because that's what Jesus appears to be talking to us about. And what he's admonishing us for is for the sake of count the cost, understand a life of sacrifice, practice these things as spiritual practices, so that when the rubber really meets the road, you've already established your way. That's why I'm concerned about this. And so I want to bring it up. I said before, I want to try to talk about it directly because, as I said the other week, like, I'm not here to just give us fluff about, this is all going to be wonderful. And we have had plenty of speaking about glory to glory and ever increasing glory. But I think one of the places that I'm concerned about is where we've been come up short in discussing and is helping people understand not necessarily I don't want to call it the value of suffering, but the place that suffering has in life, and that we have to reconcile this. We have to reconcile suffering in order to be able to remain faithful, because you don't stay faithful by staying comfortable. When we have our comfort and we give prophetic words that are all comforting and pleasing to the ear, it doesn't help establish the roots of faith that can hold us in hard times. And if I'm understanding the Bible correctly, what matters less is whether or not this is the end times with capital letters. And what matters more is our faithfulness in our hard times. So, we're going to look at this tonight. We're going to look at the second half of this short passage of Matthew 24. So let's read that. This is verses 9 to 14. It says, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures till the end will be saved. And the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come." So first, I'm not going to recap the entire first section, but I do want to remind us of the context. Jesus' disciples had come to him and asked him, "Hey, can you explain to us what the signs of the time of your coming will be? What will the sign of your coming and the end of the age be?" And Jesus says to them, well, number one, Many people will come and portray themselves as the Messiah. And we spoke about that, but that there have been many people throughout history, and even back in Jesus' day, that were telling people that they were the Messiah. Messiah means the anointed one. And so what he says is, don't be led astray by those people. Don't be distracted by them. And then he says, there will also be wars and rumors of wars. There will be political upheaval. There will be political posturing between nations. Nation will rise against nation. And we think that's war, but nations can rise against nations with political posturing as well. And so there will also be famines. How many famines are not an... Famines are a fairly common occurrence, or have been throughout biblical history and history itself. There will be earthquakes. So all these things, I love how we think that we're supposed to wait for this. So I'm going to give you this little thing about end times and eschatology, that there's one view that looks at this and everything about eschatology is future. Now the problem with that view that says tribulation in the future, one world government in the future, a third temple in the future, and all that whole view that's kind of put together its own system. One of the problems with that, frankly among many others, is that wars and rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes, among other things, have all been going on for centuries. So the conceptual, systematic structure of everything is future has its problems and faults in that these things have all been going on anyway. And so this, one of the guys from the Bible Project puts it this way. He says, in other words, a normal day in the life of human beings, right? We experience hardship. And Jesus says, don't be alarmed by this. Don't be alarmed by tumultuous division among humanity. Don't be alarmed by a shaking in the stability of life. And I don't want to analogize and give illustrations to the wrong things. But Jesus goes on to say that there's a birth illustration that I'm giving you in this. He says, this is just the beginning of the birth pains. And as a guy, I don't understand that full concept, but if you've given birth, you're hearing what I'm saying and you're going, oh, I get that. And I'm thinking, and as someone who's only helped my children be born, didn't do the hard work, I'm thinking, these are only the beginnings of the birth pains. And I'm going, what? Which means there's this point called transition where the contractions go from bad to worse. Holy cow, this is really picking up all that breathing. So there's a point at which the contractions go from bad to worse. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, this is the beginning. That's why I'm saying, holy smokes, if this is how we're responding as the church in America right now, I'm concerned that when it gets worse, that the very thing Jesus is saying, I hope this doesn't happen, is going to happen. That whole walking away from the faith, being disenfranchised by the things we're going to look at next. Because it's not to say that that if these things happen, that it's okay. I think Jesus is saying we need to work hard for this not to happen. Most likely we're going to feel like we're fighting a failing effort, but he never gives us permission to not try. These are the reasons that this concerns me. Our job is not to know the time, but to remain faithful to the end or our end. Because the indications of this passage is that it looks like things are going to get worse. Now, if you let's make sure that we're not fatalistic here just for the moment. Because Jesus is saying that just like childbirth, there's difficulty and then it gets really intense. But is that the end of the story? No. You birth a child and joy follows. So as we think about these things, the point is not to be fatalistic. The point is to actually understand we need be faithful to the end or our end. That's an important distinction, because there's a wonderful thing on the other side of that we're promised of the church. Matthew 24:9 says this: they will then, meaning after, and we have, my mind can't think of this in any other way but a linear time frame. At a certain point, it's gonna get harder. Linear time. Then they will deliver you up to, there's this interesting word here, tribulation in the ESV. Now it's a small t, so it doesn't mean the big one. He's not necessarily referring to what we think is the big one. They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. So what are the features right there? Well, persecution of the church, persecution directly towards God's people. The church and the people of God around the world will be persecuted, they will be despised, and they will be put to death. The question is, for what? Hasn't this, though, been going on for generations? Hasn't this already been happening? Just not in America. We've been allowed to worship freely, to gather freely without any restraints until literally the last couple months. And we have, think about what our response has been if we've not been allowed to gather at all. Think about what our response has been if we feel the slightest restriction on our individual freedom with regard to worshiping. How have we responded in a godly fashion? I'm not sure. Yet our brothers and sisters around the world have been faced with, when they come to Christ, they can be excommunicated from their family, they can be imprisoned, they can be put to death. They're not allowed to worship in public. They're worshiping in houses, and they're packing houses. They're packing small spaces, standing room only for the sake of Jesus, knowing that they can still be persecuted for it. And yet, they don't stop. And yet, we've chosen not to come. We've chosen, maybe I'll catch it online because it's more convenient. Put aside the genuine considerations for a moment. I'm not for catching it online. Do you know that I think it was Barna just did a study. They're saying that how much of the people that have not come back to church already will not be coming back to church? I don't know the numbers. I'm not always that good with, I don't love math, so I'm not great with numbers. But here's the point. That they also say this, that in their study, that the people that choose to not go back to church when they genuinely could, but they choose convenience and comfort and just simply say, oh, I'll catch it online. The people that choose that, after a number of weeks, they actually drift away. They go from not meeting with God's people, they go to, I'll catch it online, and then after a couple weeks of that, they just kind of stop tuning in. And their Sunday morning, maybe their Saturday night, whatever, just becomes no more. That's a point that I think is a possibility. What's another feature of this tribulation? Not the tribulation, but what Jesus is talking about here in Matthew 24. What's another feature? Well, that there will be a rejecting of the faith, and there will be division of God's people. Verse 10 says, "And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another." And so the fruit of this persecution is that people will fall away. We hear the word apostasy and the great falling away, and we keep thinking future end times. But look what's happened right now. There's this other word for stumbling. Now, as far as betraying one another and hating one another, it says they will fall away and they will betray one another and hate one another. This is just interesting to me when I saw it start to happen. You may have seen it on the news that our politicians, way back at least in the springtime, were encouraging people to report those people around them that were doing things like not wearing masks and not social distancing. Our politicians were encouraging people to call authorities on each other. And they were actually coming out and saying the phrase, "Snitches get paid." I'm not here to be political about these things. What I am trying to point out is, like, that's an interesting thing that is not an indication to me of time relative to Jesus' return. It still, to me, is a concrete example, something that seems similar to what Jesus is saying, and that is very counter, in my perspective, I guess, of loving one another, loving your neighbor, or telling on them. It just seems so tugging at the idea. So it's not to make the point of relative to the timing of Jesus' return. It's more to highlight ways in which God's people will walk in love toward one another. And that here's another point. Loving one another is not a unilateral expression. Loving one another is a very complex, it's fairly complex, it's very dynamic in its interpretations, in its understandings. I can look at it just through the lens of my life and say, well, I know what should be the public policy. But someone else is not walking in my shoes and has a totally different line of responsibility or weight that they carry and obligations and so forth. There's these tensions between those that have jobs and those that own businesses. Those two people are going to think very differently about the same subject. How do we love one another? How do we honor the fact, instead of coming down with our one-sided, this is the way it should be, how do we see each other's perspective? At least enough to listen. We're not told to agree in Scripture. We're told to love one another and treat each other with honor and dignity. And I would just encourage us how we do that online as well. Then he says another feature is false prophets. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not even going to get into this one. There's probably a lot of mining here, but I don't feel like getting into false prophet stuff right now. It'd be a totally big discussion and another discussion itself. So I don't want to just skip over something and be seen as like coincidentally skipping over. I'm telling you right now, yes, I see this in here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it at all. He also says that lawlessness will increase and love will decrease. Verse 12, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. Now, certainly it seems like we see lawlessness going on in our society right now. riots that are tearing down and burning property, businesses that are being destroyed, and more. We see society's leaders reporting on these things and just minimizing them with language. We see police with somewhat hands tied and unable to impose the laws, while people are doing things that even a short time ago would have been completely illegal. Now, I mean, I don't know about you, but I can't walk into a store right now and just walk out with something. But under the name of bringing justice, this is going on. And again, I'm not trying to get political, but you'll notice that it's hard not to. What does that tell you? I'm going to tell you what that tells me. This is a little bit of an aside to this point right here. When we're at the place where our conversations have a hard time steering away from being politicized, and that means, what I mean by that is, Robin, you and I may have a different perspective on the same subject. When we're at those places, what to me is really at hand is the challenge for who is Lord and Master of all. And the thrones and principalities in the spiritual realm are warring against humanity, who is supposed to profess Jesus as Lord. That is one of the big concerns I have about how we interact on these subjects. Because I don't want to divide with someone over a spiritual manipulation that's going on. Because another human being is technically never my enemy. Being driven by the spiritual stuff that's behind, contesting for the rulership and ownership of the world. That's honestly what's going on spiritually and playing out in the natural. So we see lawlessness, though, even today. And I'm pointing that out, again, that to try to say, this doesn't mean we're in a place of Jesus is 7 years away and we're 3 years away from hardship. Because we're already in hardship, and our brothers and sisters have been in hardship for decades in other places of the world. So my point is instead to say this is a message about order and chaos, order versus chaos as well. When you see lawlessness, Jesus is referring, could Jesus be referring to, and I believe he is, that he's talking about God is a God of order. Lawlessness and chaos and disorder contend for that space and the rulership of the world. Can we not fall into the trap of participating in chaotic behavior, but establish love and honor of one another, which keeps peace, which also maintains law and the order of creation as opposed to chaos? Because that chaos, Jesus is saying, in that time the love of many will grow cold. People will become disenfranchised the more chaos they see around the world and around them. Whereas if we can maintain, not order as in rules and regulations, but order as in, I don't jump over the boundary of your humanness and your otherness from me. I don't jump over that boundary and break that down. We maintain an order with how we communicate and how we interact and things like that. And there is a peace in our community that whether it releases the presence of God or demonstrates the presence of God or facilitates the presence of God, it is a depiction of the kingdom's presence itself when order is maintained and when love is abounding between God's people and community. And so what are the conclusions? I'm going to end with the last part of this passage as a couple concluding points. First of all, Jesus admonishes his hearers to endure till the end. Verse 13. Because this is kind of like a because, but the one who endures till the end will be saved, and the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed through the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So even here he's saying, in the light of this lawlessness, this falling away, this all the potential that might be happening, that Jesus seems to say will happen, we nonetheless, as the people of God, are encouraged, we are admonished to remain faithful to the end. Now, I am saying we are admonished to remain faithful to the end or our end because there is a view of end times that everything is history. Everything is future, not history. Everything is future still. So we are encouraged if we are in that time, but keep in mind that every generation since Jesus has seen themselves in the light of the potential of Jesus' second coming. Every single generation. What is the indication that we are any closer? So if it is, then if we are the ones that would see that generation, or be that generation, then it is incumbent on us, according to Jesus, to remain faithful to the end. But if we are not that generation, and if it is a representation of how to remain faithful in times of hardship, then it is simply the end, or remain faithful to your end, because Jesus never gave us an out as except in the face of death. We actually are admonished, exhorted by Jesus, both here and in Revelation, in multiple places, including the challenge to the 7 churches, but also with reference to this taking of the mark of the beast, and he who overcomes, and he who doesn't do that. Remain faithful to God until Jesus comes, or even if it will cost you your life. Or remain faithful to him until the end of your life. That's what Scripture is telling us. Even in the face of hardship and difficulty. Now, if I don't go to church because they've asked me to, someone's put restrictions on my freedom in being there, is that not being faithful to Jesus? No, not at all. This is about professing him as Lord. But when we come to Christ, we make a commitment, like marriage, to other people. We're committed to Christ, his church, and his cause. Not one at the exclusion of the other. The gathering together of God's people is not just when it's convenient, because we need each other as well. And so if we as the church are letting these minor things take us out from one of those 3 commitments, what is the potential to happen for us when the rubber meets the road, whether it's the rubber or just hard times of our life? What's our potential if these things will take us out? And finally, in conclusion, our job is to keep proclaiming. Jesus says that this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world, and then the end will come. And again, in a future interpretation, the challenge will be to proclaim the gospel of the Lordship of Jesus during the time of the end of the age. But nonetheless, what about a personal perspective? That when we've hit hardship, how many times have you gone through hardship, and I've gone through hardship? Has it caused us to